But when you can at least, in principle, separate the sex act from its natural consequences, all of a sudden it can take on different meanings. And then sex itself no longer comes to be seen as inherently reproductive and therefore inherently heterosexual and therefore inherently tied to marriage, right? All of that used to be all together, right? Sexuality, reproduction, marriage, traditional like religious morality, all of those were like tightly bound together. And the sexual revolution comes and basically splits the atom, and each one goes in its separate direction. Reproduction is one thing, I can choose. Sexuality is another thing. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with reproduction anymore. And because of that, neither one necessarily has to do anything with marriage or morality. All of those become separate. Do you see? So for many modern people, they cannot conceive that, that sexuality is anything other than my personal choice, what I do with my body. I'm sovereign over what I do. There are no moral rules that apply other than just consent or something like that, right? So all of these things that are by nature and by also religion and so forth, tightly bound together, they get artificially separated. At the same time, another process occurs, which is that three things which used to be separate now come to be put together. And those things are desires, actions, and identity. So people in the past, they had desires, including homosexual, like same-sex desires, existed for a long time. And we have this also in our history, our literature. This is, in one sense, a universal phenomenon. It manifests itself in different ways in different societies and places. But only in the modern period, particularly in the 20th century, does sexual desire come to be seen as an identity. Before, desire is something you feel. Whether you act on it or not, that's a different question. It depends on your morals and your values and what you think is right and wrong. You might have a desire and not act on it, right? You might have a desire and act on it, okay? But whether you act on it or not, even if you act on it, it doesn't make it your identity, right? Because look, someone could like commit zina, and that's an action, it's haram, but they don't say, oh, I'm a zani now, like this is my identity and I'm gonna go out. Like it's an action you do or you don't do, right? But it's not your identity. But sexuality comes to be conceived of as, I have desires, I must act on them if I have them, otherwise I'm not being authentic to my inner self. And my desires and identity, my desires and my actions that are based on those now go on to form the basis of a personal identity. This is not just what I feel or what I feel and what I do. It is who I am. And this is true especially with respect to like homosexual desires, same-sex desires come to be seen as I am now a gay person on the inside. And this is a new concept. Even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, if you had asked a person in the West, are you straight or gay? They wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Like they wouldn't have even identified as straight because the concept didn't exist that you are a particular quote unquote sexuality and that is core to your identity. Like all of this are new concepts. Okay. So everyone you hear people say today, everyone has a sexuality, you're either gay or straight or bisexual or whatever. Like there's all these, it's like a whole, spectrum now. But the idea that you quote unquote have a sexuality and that's core to your identity, all of this is part of a paradigm. It's part of a worldview. And this is not universally shared. And if it's more and more widespread today, it's only because Western culture continues to spread as normative through, Western cultural hegemony and the cultural output through movies and music and all of this stuff that the world is becoming more and more subjected to. But that's the only reason. There's nothing inherent about these categories. And so I'll stop now because I've been going on for a long time. But the main problem is that, what we said before is when you separate sex from like pregnancy and marriage and morality, those are all separate. Okay. For many people in the modern West, those have nothing to do with each other anymore. At the same time, desires, actions, and identity are one thing now, okay? So they took things that are supposed to be separate and they put them all together. And they took things which are supposed to be all together and they separated them. So this is now a disaster because especially when you come and say, like, if you tell someone I'm against zina in the modern West, like they'll think you're kind of old-fashioned or backwards or kind of weird, but they won't think that you're a terrible person. But if you say I'm against or my religion does not accept homosexual behavior, all of a sudden you're a bigot, you believe in discrimination, you hate people and all of this stuff. It's a very different reaction you get. And the reason is because, again, homosexuality specifically, it's not just a feeling anymore or a feeling and an action. It's become people's like actual identity. It's their core of who they actually are, not just what they do or what they feel, right? And so from their perspective, you have an arbitrary moral rule. And the reason why I say arbitrary is because in their mind, there's no natural or necessary connection anymore between the sex act and the moral rules that traditionally apply to it, which is that it has to be between a man and a woman because there's a natural teleology or purpose to sexuality, which is reproductive. I mean, all of that used to be taken for granted, okay? And so it was obvious from that paradigm why same-sex behavior was morally problematic, because it violates that natural, purpose of the body and the functions of sexuality and all of that. But all of that now is seen to be arbitrary. Okay, so when Muslims say, well, we have a rule that you have to be married to have sex, and marriage is only between a man and a woman, and anything other than that, including homosexual behavior, is haram. For them, that is an arbitrary moral rule. There's no reason for it. There's no justification for it. It's not seen as a natural, like taken for granted thing. They think, well, that's just arbitrary. It's an arbitrary moral rule. Now, your arbitrary moral rule now hits somebody not just in a thing that they want to do and you're saying they shouldn't do it, but it's undermining their very core identity, because now their identity is built on the expression of their sexual desire, particularly same-sex desire. So arbitrary moral rule hits somebody not just in terms of like something they want to do, like, okay, you want to smoke and you can't smoke, you have to go outside. It's this minor inconvenience, but it hits them in their very core identity. That's like that's a big like clash, right?
Right.
And the paradigms completely just go right past each other. And that's why people in the modern West, if you say, I'm against drinking, I'm against zina, I'm against whatever, they say, okay, that's kind of very strict and conservative. But once you say, okay, I'm also against like same-sex behavior or relationships, they experience it as like totally different, because now you're rejecting an entire person and an entire identity, and like as if you say, I'm against black people or something, like I'm against black people. You say, well, you can't, like what can they do about it, right? That's Anyway, it's kind of, and they do equate sexuality, sexual orientation with gender and race. They put them all on a par. And of course, in Islam, those are all different. Race is one thing, gender, like male, female, is something different, and sexual behavior is like three completely different things.